The exam hall was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional click of a pen. It was the day of the most important exam in the galaxy, a test where students from different planets and species came together to compete for the highest honors. Among the hundreds of students sat one human, quietly preparing for the challenge ahead. They were known across the galaxy for their incredible memory, and everyone around them couldn't help but wonder how the human would perform. At the front of the room, the alien proctor stood tall. He was a member of the Zilith species, a race with 4 long arms and eyes that glowed in the dark. His voice echoed through the hall as he announced the beginning of the exam. "This is a test of knowledge, focus, and endurance," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You will have 2 hours to complete the exam. Use your time wisely." The students around the human fidgeted nervously, some cracking their knuckles, others whispering to their friends. But the human sat still, eyes focused on the front of the room. The air felt thick with pressure, yet the human remained calm. It was as if they had done this 1,000 times before. In the row next to the human sat a young alien student named Threx. Threx was from a species known for their intelligence, but not their memory. Threx had studied hard for this exam, but still felt unsure. The other students seemed so confident, especially the human. Threx had heard the rumors. Humans had a memory like no other. They could remember entire books just by reading them once. It was a power Threx couldn't even imagine. As the exam began, Threx glanced over at the human. Their eyes were locked on the exam paper, but Threx could see the small smile that played at the edges of their lips. It was a smile of someone who knew they were ready, someone who had no doubt about their ability to succeed. Threx felt a pang of jealousy, but quickly pushed it aside. There was no time to waste. The exam had started, and they had to focus. The first question appeared on the screen in front of every student. It was a complex problem about intergalactic physics. Most of the students started scribbling notes immediately, but the human didn't even look at their paper for a moment. Instead, they closed their eyes for just a second, as if to gather their thoughts. When they opened their eyes, they picked up their pen and began writing. Each answer flowed smoothly, without hesitation. Threx's eyes widened. They couldn't believe it. The human hadn't written anything down from their notes. They were just writing the answers from memory. Threx's heart raced. How is that possible? Threx thought. How can they remember all of that so easily? Threx glanced down at their own paper. The first question was already confusing them, and they hadn't even started on the second one. As much as they tried to focus, the answers just wouldn't come. They quickly looked to the human again. The human had already moved on to the second question, their pen moving smoothly across the paper. Threx could feel a growing sense of panic. "I can't fall behind," Threx thought, feeling the pressure building. The alien student's eyes darted back and forth, trying to find a way to make things easier. It was then that Threx noticed something. The human was sitting with their backs straight, their eyes fixed on the paper, but they weren't scribbling fast. They were writing slowly, carefully, as if they were taking their time. There was no rush in their movements. A sneaky thought crept into Threx's mind. If I can just copy a few answers, I can catch up. Threx had heard about the human's great memory, but this wasn't about respecting it. It was about winning. Threx decided to sit a little closer, just enough to catch a glimpse of the human's paper. They leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the human's hand as it moved across the paper. But the human didn't notice. They were still completely absorbed in their work. Threx leaned in even more, trying to get a better look. The human's pen never stopped moving. It was almost as if the answers were already in the human's head, just waiting to be written down. Threx's eyes narrowed. How are they doing this? Threx thought. Frustrated, the alien student's fingers twitched as they fought the urge to reach out and copy the answers, but they knew it wouldn't work. They had seen the human's answers before. They weren't written in the usual way. The human didn't write down a single formula or complex equation. They simply wrote the answers as if they had already learned everything by heart. Threx took a deep breath, trying to steady their racing mind. The human was winning this battle without even trying. Threx felt a sudden wave of doubt. Maybe I've been focusing on the wrong things all along, Threx thought. Maybe the key to this exam isn't just knowledge, it's something else. As Threx sat there, still trying to keep up, they couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. This wasn't just a test of knowledge. It was a test of something much more powerful. Threx couldn't believe what was happening. As the minutes ticked by, the human continued to write answer after answer, never pausing, never second-guessing themselves. It was like the information was flowing straight from their mind onto the paper without effort. Threx, on the other hand, was struggling with every question. The more they looked at the human's perfect answers, the more frustrated they became. Threx had always been known for their sharp intellect, but memory was never their strong point. Their species could think quickly and solve complex problems, but retaining information was another story. They had studied for weeks, poring over books and data, yet it felt like nothing would stick. The human was doing what Threx had dreamed of, using their memory effortlessly, recalling everything with precision. Sitting at their desk, Threx fidgeted. Sweat started to form on their brow as the tension built. There was no way they would be able to finish this exam on time if they kept going at this pace. And then, like a spark, a thought hit Threx. I don't have to do this on my own. I can just copy off the human. The idea seemed perfect. The human's memory was flawless. Surely their answers were the key to success. Threx could sit close enough to the human and sneak a peek at the paper. They'd get the answers they needed and finish the exam with ease. Threx grinned to themselves. They'd figured it out. This was the way to win. With their plan in mind, Threx adjusted their posture. They stretched out their back, pretending to shift in their seat. They casually glanced around the room, making sure no one was watching. Everyone else was too busy with their own work to notice. But Threx couldn't take any chances. If they were going to pull this off, they had to be smart. Threx shifted their chairs slightly to the side, so they were now seated closer to the human. The human didn't seem to notice, absorbed in their work. Threx leaned in just enough to see the edge of the human's paper. The answers were written clearly, each one perfect. It was as if the human had already memorized every detail. The temptation to copy was overwhelming. Threx's eyes darted between their own paper and the human's, trying to catch a glimpse of the answers. But the human's hand moved so quickly that it was hard to follow. Every time Threx thought they had a good look, the human would shift their hand or turn the paper just enough to make it impossible to read. It was maddening. Still, Threx was determined. They would not be outsmarted by a human. Their eyes narrowed, and they made a mental note to move closer. They needed to get this right. Threx casually adjusted their chair, making small, subtle movements so they could inch closer to the human without drawing attention. With each shift, Threx found themselves sitting just a bit closer until they were practically shoulder to shoulder. The human seemed completely unaware of Threx's growing presence. They were still writing with steady confidence, as though they were the only ones in the room. Threx couldn't help but stare. The human didn't use any notes or tools, nothing but their own memory and focus. It was as if the human had tapped into some kind of secret power. Threx's hand trembled slightly as they tried to hold their paper steady. They couldn't let the human know they were copying. That would ruin everything. But with each passing second, it became harder to resist. Threx's mind raced with thoughts of what they could do if they had those perfect answers. They could finish the exam quickly, then relax. Maybe even become a top student, just like the human. Finally, Threx saw an opening. The human had paused for just a moment, looking at the ceiling as if deep in thought. It was the perfect opportunity. Threx glanced down at the paper, quickly copying a few answers. They didn't even need to understand what they were writing. They just needed to get the answers down. The plan was working. Threx's heart raced with excitement as they jotted down what they had copied. They glanced up at the human again, but the human hadn't noticed a thing. Threx felt a wave of relief. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could stop them. But just as quickly as the feeling came, it was gone. Frex looked back at their own paper and realized something. This wasn't right. They had just copied the answers without truly understanding them. Would they be able to remember any of it once the exam was over? The alien student's confidence began to waver. For a second, doubt crept into Threx's mind. Was it really worth it to cheat? What if the answers didn't make sense, and the human knew something Threx didn't? Threx looked at the human again. They had never once hesitated, never once glanced around for help. The human wasn't relying on anyone but themselves. Threx's plan had worked for now. But deep inside, the alien student knew something was missing. They were cheating, but they weren't truly learning. They weren't using their own mind to solve the problems. They were just copying, and that didn't feel like winning at all. Threx sat back in their chair, feeling both nervous and guilty. They had copied a few answers from the human, but something about it didn't sit right. Every time Threx glanced over at the human, they could see that the human wasn't struggling. They weren't rushing. They weren't looking at anyone else for help. It was as if the answers were coming to them from thin air. Threx stared in awe, unable to understand how the human could be so calm while everyone else was frantically working. The alien student shifted in their seat, their mind racing. What's their secret? Threx thought, trying to focus on their own paper again. The human had already moved on to the next section of the exam. Every answer the human wrote down was flawless, precise. Threx tried to copy more, but each time they looked over, the human seemed one step ahead. Threx paused for a moment. Something felt off. The human wasn't using notes, no gadgets, no hidden tricks. It was just their brain. Threx couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Why does the human seem so different? Threx wondered. As the exam dragged on, Threx couldn't stop looking at the human. There was no panic in their face, no sign of stress. They moved through the questions with a quiet confidence that made Threx question everything they thought they knew about studying. How was this possible? It was as if the human had mastered the entire exam without ever looking at a book. Threx's curiosity grew. They glanced down at their own answers, feeling the weight of the cheating. The answers they had copied didn't make sense to them. It was all just a jumble of words and formulas they hadn't really understood. But the human? The human's answers were clear, logical, and perfect. Threx realized that they had missed the point of the test entirely. It wasn't about copying the answers. It was about truly understanding them. But how had the human done it? Threx couldn't help but watch the human again. The human paused for just a second, looking up at the ceiling as if in deep thought. Then, without looking at their notes, the human wrote down the next answer with perfect clarity. Threx couldn't believe it. They're not looking at anything, Threx whispered to themselves. How do they remember all of this? That was when it hit Threx. The human wasn't using their notes because they didn't need them. The secret was their memory. The human's memory wasn't like anyone else's. It was something else entirely. Threx had heard stories about humans before. They were always described as having extraordinary memories. But Threx had never understood what that meant until now. The human's secret weapon was simple, yet powerful. Their ability to remember everything. Threx looked back down at their own paper, feeling a sense of defeat. How could I ever compete with that? Threx thought. The alien student had been so focused on finding a way to cheat, they hadn't realized that the true power was in the human's mind. All those hours of studying, all the books they had read, they didn't hold a candle to the human's natural ability to memorize and recall information. For the first time in the exam, Threx felt truly helpless. The answers weren't in a book, or a note, or a gadget. They were in the human's brain, stored away like a vault, ready to be unlocked whenever needed. Threx had been relying on shortcuts, hoping to get by with cheating, but it was clear now that the human had something far more valuable than that. Real knowledge, stored in their mind, ready to be used at any moment. Frex couldn't help but wonder how the human had developed such an amazing memory. Were they born with it, or had they worked hard to build it over time? Either way, it was clear that this was something that couldn't be copied. Frex couldn't just steal the human's answers. They couldn't even begin to understand how the human's mind worked. Feeling a mix of awe and frustration, Frex leaned back in their chair. The human's secret weapon wasn't a trick. It wasn't technology or some clever cheat. It was their mind, and Frex realized they had underestimated it. This wasn't just a memory. It was a level of focus and understanding that Frex could never replicate by simply copying answers. As the exam continued, Frex's mind began to shift. No longer were they focused on cheating or shortcuts. They started to wonder if they could learn something from the human. Maybe, just maybe, if they could improve their own memory, they could unlock the same kind of power. The human wasn't relying on gadgets, and neither would Frex. It was time to stop looking for easy ways out and start focusing on the real challenge, learning and understanding. But for now, Frex could only watch as the human continued to fill out the exam paper, each answer a testament to their incredible memory. Frex couldn't deny it anymore. The human's secret weapon was not something that could be copied. It was something that had to be earned through dedication, focus, and an unshakable belief in the power of their own mind. The ticking of the clock grew louder in Frex's ears as they glanced anxiously at their paper. Time was running out. The exam was nearly halfway through, and Frex had only answered a few questions. Their mind felt like it was spinning, and the pressure was mounting. They had seen the human's perfect answers, and it only reminded them of how far behind they were. Frex's gaze shifted toward the human again. The human's pen never stopped. They were focused, writing quickly and without hesitation. It was as if the answers were already imprinted in their mind. Frex's stomach tightened with a feeling they hadn't expected. Fear. They had relied too much on cheating, on copying the human's work. But now, even that wasn't enough. The answers they had copied felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. They couldn't understand them. Worse, they couldn't remember the formulas or the steps to solve the problems. The pressure was eating away at them. Desperation started to creep into Frex's thoughts. What can I do? They thought, their fingers tapping nervously on the desk. They had never been in this situation before. Frex had always been quick on their feet, always able to outsmart the competition. But today, it felt like nothing they did was working. Frex glanced at the human again. This time, the human was finishing the next section of the exam, their hand moving swiftly over the paper. Frex's eyes narrowed in frustration. How are they doing this? Frex wondered. I studied for weeks. They didn't even look at a single book. And still, they're ahead. They're always ahead. Frex's mind began to race. They knew they couldn't keep copying forever. If they got caught, it would be over. Frex wasn't sure how much longer they could keep pretending that they were solving the problems on their own. The answer to the test wasn't in copying. It was in understanding. But Frex couldn't understand. Not like the human. The human's brain seemed to work in a way that Frex could never match. Frex's desperation grew. They needed a way out. They needed to finish this exam, even if it meant doing something extreme. They couldn't fail. Not after all the work they had put in. Not after all the expectations they had to live up to. Without realizing it, Frex shifted closer to the human's desk again. Their eyes darted to the human's paper. Maybe, just maybe, they could copy just a few more answers. They had already copied some, so what difference would it make? Frex tried to ignore the growing feeling of guilt gnawing at them. They had made it this far, so why not go all the way? But then, as Frex reached for the human's paper, they noticed something. The human wasn't writing from notes or from memory alone. It was more than that. The answers were coming to them, as if they were seeing the entire problem solved in their mind. Every equation, every word, seemed to flow into place without effort. It wasn't just the human's memory. It was something else. Frex couldn't understand it, but they knew they were missing something important. In that moment, something inside Threx snapped. The fear of failing took over completely. They couldn't let this slip through their fingers. They needed those answers. And they needed them now. Threx quickly jotted down some notes from the human's paper, hoping it would be enough to fill in the gaps. Their hands shook with anxiety as they wrote down what they could. They didn't care if they understood it. All that mattered was finishing. But even as Threx scribbled, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were losing something much more valuable than just a passing grade. They weren't solving the problems. They weren't learning anything. They were only getting closer to the human's answers, but further from the knowledge itself. Threx's desperation reached its peak when the proctor walked by. The alien supervisor's sharp eyes scanned the room, stopping for a moment at Threx's desk. Threx froze, holding their breath. They quickly hid their paper, trying to act natural, but the proctor didn't seem convinced. Threx could feel their heart racing in their chest. The pressure of being caught, of failing, was almost too much to bear. The proctor glanced at the human, then back at Threx, before moving on. Threx let out a shaky breath. That was too close. It was clear that if they kept trying to copy, they were bound to be caught. The realization hit Threx like a wave. They had no choice but to rely on themselves. No more shortcuts, no more cheating. If they wanted to finish this exam, they had to actually solve the problems on their own. Threx's mind raced, trying to push past the panic. The humans' perfect answers weren't going to help them anymore. Threx had to trust in their own abilities. They had to dig deep and focus. The pressure wasn't going to go away. But if they didn't try, they would fail. Threx glanced at their paper once more, their heart pounding. They had to start over. They had to solve these problems from the beginning, by themselves. Taking a deep breath, Threx picked up their pen and started writing again. This time, they didn't look at anyone else. They didn't worry about what the human was doing. It was time to face the challenge head-on. Threx knew it wouldn't be easy, but the desperation was gone. Now, there was only one thing left to do. Learn. Threx's mind buzzed with confusion as the exam continued. They stared at their paper, the equations and questions all starting to blur together. The pressure weighed heavily on their shoulders, but something inside them had shifted. They couldn't cheat anymore. They had tried, but the answers didn't make sense, and copying the human's work had only brought them closer to failure. But now, as Threx looked down at their paper, something clicked. For the first time, Threx realized what had been so different about the human. It wasn't just the memory, the ability to recall information. It was the understanding. The human wasn't just remembering facts. They were seeing the bigger picture, making connections, and solving the problems in ways that Threx hadn't even considered. Threx sat back in their chair and took a deep breath. The panic was still there, but it was starting to fade. They looked around the room, watching as the other students scribbled away, some looking frustrated, some calm, but all working. The human wasn't the only one who had an incredible memory. Threx had their own strengths. They had always been quick to solve problems, fast at analyzing and breaking things down. But now, for the first time, Threx saw that there was something even more important than speed: understanding. The truth hit Threx like a ton of bricks. They had been so focused on shortcuts, on finding an easy way out, that they had missed the entire point of the exam. It wasn't about memorizing facts or copying answers. It was about solving problems, about thinking critically. And that was what the human had done. They hadn't just memorized answers. They had solved the problems from the ground up, understanding every step along the way. Threx felt a strange mix of admiration and frustration. They had spent so much time trying to catch up to the human, trying to take the easy way out, that they had forgotten the most important lesson of all. There was no shortcut to true knowledge. The human wasn't special because they could memorize everything. They were special because they could think through the problems, break them down, and find the answers. Threx sat up straighter. For the first time, they started to see the problems in a new light. They picked up their pen, looked at the first equation and began to think. Instead of trying to force the answers into place, they focused on understanding what the question was asking. They broke it down, step by step, and slowly, the solution began to take shape. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Frex looked over at the human again. They were still writing, still working steadily. But now, Frex didn't feel the same envy. Instead, they felt something different: respect. The human wasn't using any tricks. They were simply using their mind, their ability to think critically and apply what they knew. That was the true secret weapon, the thing that Frex had been missing. The more Frex worked, the more they realized how much they had underestimated the human. The human wasn't perfect because they could remember everything. They were perfect because they understood everything. Frex had been so focused on finding an easier way, they had forgotten the value of real learning. Now, as they slowly solved each question, Frex could feel a sense of accomplishment that had never come with cheating. The truth was clear now. It wasn't about the answers. It was about how you got there. Frex had spent so much time trying to find shortcuts that they had missed the journey. The human hadn't just memorized answers. They had learned. They had spent the time to truly understand the material. And that made all the difference. Frex looked at their paper once more, their mind clearer than it had been all exam. They had been so desperate, so focused on catching up to the human, that they had forgotten the most important lesson of all. True knowledge came from effort, from struggle, from understanding. The human had shown Frex the truth. It wasn't about finding an easy way out. It was about putting in the work, thinking critically, and solving problems with understanding. Frex smiled to themselves, a small but genuine smile. They had learned something important today, something that would stay with them long after the exam was over. With newfound confidence, Frex finished the exam, not with perfect answers, but with answers that made sense, answers that came from their own understanding, from their own mind. They knew they hadn't copied the human's work. They hadn't taken the easy way. They had done it their way. And that, in the end, was the true victory. As Frex handed in their paper, they couldn't help but look over at the human one last time. The human was still writing, calm and focused. Frex felt a deep sense of respect for them. The human had taught Frex something far more important than any exam could offer: the value of learning, the power of understanding, and the strength that came from using their own mind. The final minutes of the exam ticked away. Frex's pen hovered above the last question, but their mind was still racing. They had finished the problems, but it wasn't the result that was on their mind now. It was the journey. The exam had started as a race, a competition to see who could finish first. Frex had wanted to win, to prove themselves, but now, after everything that had happened, winning didn't seem as important. Frex looked around the room, watching as the other students put down their pens, some satisfied, others looking a little worried. The human was still writing, as steady and calm as ever. Frex noticed something different about them now. It wasn't just that the human was finishing their exam with ease. It was how they had worked throughout the entire test. Focused, thoughtful, and patient. Frex leaned back in their chair, a strange feeling bubbling inside them. It wasn't envy anymore. It was respect. The human had shown them a whole new way of thinking, a way of learning that didn't rely on shortcuts or tricks. It relied on hard work, patience, and understanding. Frex felt a small but genuine sense of pride that they had learned this lesson, even if it had taken an entire exam for it to sink in. The proctor's voice broke through the silence, announcing that there were only a few minutes left. Frex quickly checked their answers one last time, trying to be sure they hadn't missed anything. They felt a sense of calm that they hadn't had at the beginning of the exam. For the first time, Frex knew they had done their best. No cheating, no shortcuts, just their own effort and understanding. As the proctor called out the final warning, Frex's eyes darted toward the human. They had finished, their paper neatly set down on the desk. The human didn't look around or glance at anyone else. They were just quietly waiting. Threx had no idea what the human's score would be, but they knew one thing for sure. The human had earned it. The exam ended with the proctor's loud signal. Everyone stood up to hand in their papers, but Threx hesitated for a moment. They looked at their own answers one last time, feeling an odd sense of peace. Sure, they might not have scored the highest, but Threx was no longer worried. They had learned something far more valuable today. As Threx handed in their paper and made their way back to their seat, they noticed something strange. The human was standing in front of the proctor, speaking quietly but confidently. Threx couldn't hear the words, but the expression on the proctor's face was one of surprise. The human had caught the proctor's attention somehow. Threx couldn't help but wonder what was going on. A few moments later, the proctor nodded and gestured for the human to take a seat again. Threx watched, confused. Why had the human gotten special attention? It wasn't uncommon for students to speak with the proctor after an exam, but the look of surprise on the proctor's face made Threx wonder if something more had happened. When the results were handed out, Threx's heart skipped a beat. They glanced at the paper, scanning for their own score. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to pass. They felt a wave of relief. Then, Threx looked over at the human's paper, curious about their score. But when they saw it, Threx's jaw dropped. The human had scored a perfect 100%, but it wasn't the score that shocked Threx. It was the note written at the top. Exceptional work, beyond the normal expectations. I've never seen someone grasp these concepts so quickly. You're ready for the next level. Threx stared in disbelief. How had the human done this? It was more than just remembering answers. It was about understanding, about seeing the bigger picture. The human had impressed not only the proctor, but also the entire class. Threx turned to look at the human, who had a small, satisfied smile on their face. The human wasn't gloating or celebrating. They were just calm, as if they had known all along that their hard work would pay off. It was then that Threx realized the true lesson of the exam. It wasn't about the grade. It wasn't about winning or being the fastest. It was about the effort, the dedication, and the understanding that went into solving the problems. The human had shown Threx what true learning looked like, and it was something Threx would never forget. As the class started to pack up and leave, Threx took one last look at the human. They didn't need to be the best or the fastest. They didn't need to cheat or cut corners. The human had earned their score through hard work and understanding. And Threx, for the first time, realized that that was enough. They didn't need to compete with the human anymore. They just needed to learn, to grow, and to do their best. And with that, Threx walked out of the exam room with a new sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the true victory was in the learning itself. The days following the exam felt different for Threx. They walked through the halls of the academy with a new sense of purpose, their mind buzzing with the lessons they had learned. It wasn't just about the exam or the grade anymore. It was about how they had changed, how their way of thinking had shifted. Threx had been so focused on shortcuts and competition, but now they saw things differently. The human had taught them that true success came from understanding, from effort, and from learning the real lessons, not just the answers. But Threx still had questions. The human had been a mystery to them during the whole exam. How could they stay so calm and focused while everyone else seemed to be struggling? How did they manage to understand the material so easily? Threx couldn't help but feel a growing curiosity about them, a curiosity that went beyond just the exam. They wanted to know more, to learn from the human, but they didn't know how to approach them. One afternoon, as Threx was walking down the hall, they spotted the human sitting alone in the courtyard, reading a book. The human seemed so peaceful, so at ease with themselves. Threx hesitated for a moment, unsure if they should approach. But then, something inside them urged them to go forward. They had learned so much from this person already, and maybe, just maybe, they could learn even more. With a deep breath, Threx walked over to the human and sat down across from them. The human looked up from their book, a small smile crossing their face when they saw Threx. "Oh hey," the human said, their voice calm and friendly. "You're Threx, right?" Threx nodded, feeling a little nervous. "Yes. I wanted to talk to you about the exam." The human raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. "Sure, what about it?" Threx hesitated for a moment before speaking. You were different during the exam. You didn't seem worried or rushed. How did you do it? How did you understand everything so well?" The human's smile softened, and they closed the book, giving Threx their full attention. "Well, to be honest, I didn't really focus on being perfect. I just tried to understand what the questions were asking. I've always believed that if you truly understand the problem, the solution will come to you." Threx looked at them, confused but intrigued. "But how do you know what to do?" "I kept getting stuck. It felt like the answers were just out of my reach." The human thought for a moment, then spoke again. "It's okay to get stuck. The important thing is not to give up when that happens. Sometimes you just need to take a step back, breathe, and look at the problem from a different angle. It's about being patient with yourself and trusting that you can figure it out." Threx nodded slowly, processing the words. They hadn't thought about it that way before. They had always been in such a hurry to finish, to beat the clock, but now they understood that taking time and thinking carefully was just as important. "I wish I had known that during the exam," Threx admitted. "I was so focused on finishing quickly that I forgot about actually understanding the problems." The human smiled gently. "It's all right. You're learning now, and that's what matters. Everyone has their own pace. The key is to keep going, to keep learning." Threx felt a warmth in their chest at the human's words. There was no judgment, no criticism, just understanding. It was something Threx hadn't expected, but it made them feel better about the whole experience. Maybe they didn't have to be perfect after all. "Thanks," Threx said, their voice soft. "I needed to hear that." The human's smile grew. "Anytime. We all have moments where we get stuck. The important thing is to keep trying and learn from it." There was a brief pause before Threx spoke again. "I've been thinking about something else, too. About how I was always competing with you during the exam. I was trying to be better, faster. But now I realize that wasn't the right way to think. I should have been learning, not just trying to win." The human looked thoughtful. "I get that. It's easy to get caught up in competition, but learning isn't a race. It's a journey. And we all have our own path." Threx smiled, feeling the sense of relief. For the first time, they didn't feel like they were falling behind or failing. They were simply learning, growing, and moving forward. "You're right," Threx said quietly. "I think I've been too focused on trying to be the best. Maybe I need to start focusing on being the best version of myself." The human nodded. "That's a great way to put it. Everyone has their own strengths, and that's what makes us unique." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the courtyard. Threx sat there, feeling something new and unfamiliar, a sense of peace. They had come to the human to learn something about exams, but they had ended up learning something much bigger. The importance of patience, understanding, and friendship. "You know," Threx said, breaking the silence, "I think we could learn a lot from each other. Maybe we could study together sometime." The human's eyes lit up with a smile. "I'd like that. I think we'd make a good team." And just like that, a new friendship began. It wasn't about being the best, or winning, or even passing exams. It was about learning together, growing together, and supporting each other along the way. Threx and the human had come a long way, from rivals to friends, and they both knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would take them far beyond the classroom. Alex stepped into the enormous exam hall, his heart racing a little. He had never seen so many different kinds of aliens in one place. From the towering, six-legged insect-like creatures to the tiny glowing beings who hovered in the air, the room was filled with beings of all shapes, sizes, and colors. They were all preparing for the most important exam of the year, the Intergalactic Intelligence Test, which would determine the smartest species in the galaxy. As Alex looked around, he noticed the aliens were all doing something that made him feel a bit uneasy. They were all sitting at their desks, adjusting the neural interfaces they wore like headsets. These interfaces were designed to connect directly to their brains, boosting their intelligence and allowing them to solve complex problems in seconds. The aliens didn't need to think hard. The neural tech did all that heavy lifting. Alex didn't have any such device. He had refused it when they offered it to him. He didn't want to rely on technology. In his mind, humans were capable of great things without the need for any fancy gadgets. He believed that a sharp mind and clear thinking were all he needed. But now, standing in the middle of the exam hall, surrounded by species who thought nothing of using technology to boost their intellect, Alex started to feel self-conscious. One alien, a tall creature with silver scales and piercing blue eyes, turned to look at him. It wasn't just a glance. It was more like a stare. "What's this?" The alien's voice came, smooth and deep. "No neural interface. How do you plan to survive this exam, human?" Alex swallowed but didn't let the mockery show on his face. He simply smiled. "I'll manage. I trust my brain." The alien laughed, its voice echoing through the room. "Your brain. In a test against technology. That's cute." It wasn't just one alien. A few others, seated nearby, turned to look at Alex, shaking their heads. They whispered to each other, obviously amused. "He's going to fail," another alien murmured, this one covered in shimmering green fur, its voice light with laughter. Alex didn't let their words bother him. He knew the truth. Humans were underestimated all the time. People didn't realize how capable they were without advanced tools. After all, his species had survived countless challenges throughout history, from natural disasters to war, and they had done it with their own resourcefulness. The aliens continued to snicker among themselves as they settled into their seats. They put on their neural interfaces, adjusting them until they fit perfectly. The devices glowed with soft blue light, linking them to their minds, ready to give them the edge in the test. Alex felt a small pang of doubt, but he pushed it away. He could do this. He was a human. The human mind was stronger than they realized. The exam began. The room was silent except for the soft sounds of aliens typing quickly on their desks. Alex glanced at the first question on his screen. It was a logic puzzle, something humans were particularly good at solving. He took a deep breath and began to work through the problem, focusing on each step, letting his mind process the information naturally. Around him, the aliens were moving fast. Their interfaces were working at top speed, answering questions in the blink of an eye. Some of them barely even had to think before selecting the right answer. It was as if the technology was doing all the work for them. Alex couldn't help but notice how they seemed almost robotic, each one tapping away without pausing to think, as if the answers were just being fed directly to their minds. But that wasn't how Alex worked. He didn't rely on tech. He relied on himself. He kept moving through the problems, one after another, without rushing. The aliens, however, had begun to show signs of frustration. Their screens flickered every now and then, as if something was wrong. Alex caught a few glances of nervous looks from the aliens around him. They were struggling. The interfaces were giving them too much information at once, making it difficult for them to focus. Alex didn't know it yet, but the aliens' over-reliance on their neural devices was going to be their biggest mistake. As they sped through the test, they were missing important details, failing to properly analyze the questions. They didn't realize it, but the very technology they depended on was starting to confuse them. Meanwhile, Alex kept his cool. He smiled to himself as he solved each problem, carefully thinking through every step. No tech, just his brain. But the aliens were still watching him. some with pity, others with outright disdain. They couldn't understand how someone could be so slow. To them, it seemed impossible that anyone could finish the exam without using neural interfaces. As the minutes ticked by, Alex kept working steadily, blocking out their whispers, their mocking looks. The countdown clock on the wall ticked down to the final moments. The aliens around him were still typing away furiously, trying to finish. Some looked frustrated, some desperate. But Alex was already done. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, knowing he had done his best. And now, all he had to do was wait. The room went quiet. The soft hum of the exam hall was the only sound, and the countdown clock on the wall ticked down the seconds. Alex sat at his desk, eyes focused on the screen in front of him. He could hear the faint clicks and taps of the other aliens as they typed furiously, their neural interfaces buzzing with activity. He was calm. He trusted his mind. On the other hand, the aliens around him were a blur of motion, their hands moving with speed and precision. They barely glanced at the questions on the screen before their fingers moved like lightning. Their neural interfaces were working at full power, feeding them answers in real time. For them, this exam wasn't a challenge. It was almost like a game. The advanced technology made it easy. Alex, however, refused to use the neural interface. He had been offered one before the exam, but he politely turned it down. "I'll be fine on my own," he told the exam officials, who had raised their brows in surprise. To them, it was unthinkable that anyone would even consider taking the test without such technology. But Alex was determined to prove a point. He believed that humans had something special that no technology could replace, a sharp, clear mind. The first question appeared on his screen. It was a complicated logic puzzle, something that would challenge even the smartest beings in the galaxy. Alex's fingers hovered over the keys. The puzzle involved patterns, sequences, and abstract thinking. For a moment, Alex paused. It wasn't that he was unsure. It was just that he wanted to understand it completely before jumping in. That was his approach. Take it slow, think it through, and don't rush. Around him, the aliens were already typing. Some of them barely paused to read the question. Their interfaces were doing all the thinking for them, calculating and solving in a fraction of a second. The screens flashed with numbers and symbols, and answers were selected almost as if by instinct. For them, there was no need to ponder. The answers were already in their minds, fed by the technology. Alex felt a little different. His approach wasn't about speed. It was about understanding. His eyes moved slowly across the screen, processing the information bit by bit. He thought back to the lessons he had learned as a child, how his teachers had always told him to take his time and never rush. He applied that same lesson now. Minutes passed. The aliens around him were racing ahead, their movements almost robotic. Alex was still on the first question, but he wasn't worried. He felt confident that, with time, he would arrive at the right answer. The more the aliens worked, the more Alex noticed something strange. Some of them were starting to make mistakes. One alien, a small creature with soft, glowing skin, typed in a sequence that was clearly wrong. Its interface buzzed, showing a red warning. The alien frowned, backtracked, and tried again, but it couldn't seem to fix the mistake. Another alien, a tall being with 4 arms and a shimmering silver body, was also struggling. Its eyes flickered between the screen and the interface, looking confused. The tech wasn't helping. It was just confusing them even more. Alex raised an eyebrow. He didn't understand it at first. Why were these aliens, who relied so heavily on their neural interfaces, having trouble? They had the advantage, didn't they? But the more he looked around, the more he realized that the problem wasn't with the questions. It was with the technology. The neural interfaces were too fast. They were feeding the aliens answers before they could fully think them through. The alien students were rushing to keep up, afraid of falling behind. And in doing so, they were making careless mistakes. They were trying to finish too quickly, relying on the technology to do the work instead of using their own reasoning. Alex, on the other hand, was still moving at his own pace. He took a deep breath and glanced around. He saw a few of the aliens looking frustrated. One, a large hulking creature with red scales, slammed its fist on the desk in frustration. The interface had suggested an answer that didn't make sense, and now the alien was stuck, unsure of how to proceed. For Alex, it was almost like he had an advantage. The more the aliens rushed, the more they stumbled. Meanwhile, he worked through the puzzle step by step, feeling his way through the problem. He was careful. He wasn't just trying to get it right. He was trying to understand why it worked. That, he realized, was the key to solving these kinds of problems. As time passed, the tension in the room grew. The aliens, who had been so confident at the start, were now visibly stressed. Their interfaces buzzed with error messages, and their screens flashed with incorrect answers. They were trying to correct their mistakes, but they couldn't keep up. Alex, on the other hand, was still calm. He finished the first question and moved on to the next one. His mind was clear, his thoughts focused. He wasn't just answering questions. He was solving problems, using the power of his own brain. As the exam continued, Alex couldn't help but notice how the aliens were starting to glance at him. They had been mocking him earlier, but now their expressions were different. Some were surprised, others curious. No one was laughing anymore. The more they struggled with their tech, the more they seemed to respect his approach. Alex smiled quietly to himself. Maybe, just maybe, the human mind wasn't as outdated as everyone thought. The countdown clock ticked down, but Alex knew one thing for sure. He was not going to be the one to panic. The rest of the aliens, on the other hand, were a different story. The exam hall was filled with the soft sound of tapping keys and the occasional hum of alien interfaces. The first round of questions had been challenging, but Alex had moved through them with ease. His eyes stayed focused on his screen, calmly answering each question, taking his time to think. Around him, the other aliens were still typing furiously, their interfaces flashing in a blur of light. But something strange had started to happen. Alex could feel it in the air. The aliens who had once seemed so confident were now showing signs of distress. The quiet murmurs of frustration began to fill the room. One of the aliens, a creature with 4 arms and a long, slender neck, slammed a fist on the desk. It had made an error again. Its glowing interface buzzed with red error messages, and its screen flashed quickly, trying to suggest an answer. But the answer didn't make sense. The alien stared at the screen in confusion, trying to adjust the settings. Next to Alex, a tall, thin alien with skin like glass, covered in intricate patterns, was shaking its head. The interface it wore had begun to glitch. It buzzed loudly, showing multiple calculations at once, and the alien tried desperately to make sense of the chaos. But no matter what it did, the answers didn't seem to match the question. The alien's face, usually calm and collected, was now twisted in frustration. Alex couldn't help but notice the aliens' growing panic. They were struggling. The technology they had once trusted so completely was failing them. The neural interfaces, which were meant to make the exam easier, were now making things worse. The aliens had relied so much on the devices that they had forgotten how to think for themselves. Meanwhile, Alex moved steadily through the questions. He hadn't made a mistake yet. He was focused, calm, and patient. He didn't rush. Each problem, no matter how difficult, was just another puzzle to solve. His mind was clear, free from the distractions of technology. He understood what was happening now. The other aliens were too dependent on their interfaces. They were relying on their tech to think for them. And now that it wasn't working, they were losing their edge. The confusion in the room was growing. The hum of the alien interfaces grew louder as the creatures tried to fix their errors. The tall, 4-armed alien next to Alex was now muttering to itself, clearly flustered. "This isn't right," it whispered. "The interface is malfunctioning again." Alex kept his eyes on his own screen. blocking out the noise around him. He had seen something like this happen before. Alien technology was powerful, but it wasn't perfect. In fact, sometimes it could get in the way. Alex's advantage wasn't in his speed. It was in his ability to think clearly without the interference of technology. As more time passed, the aliens became more and more anxious. One of them, a small creature with large, bulbous eyes, looked like it was about to cry. It kept pressing buttons on its interface, trying to reset it, but nothing worked. The screen kept showing error messages, and each time it tried to fix one, another one popped up. Alex glanced up from his screen for just a moment, watching the chaos unfold around him. He felt a little sorry for the aliens, but he couldn't help but feel a bit smug too. They had all laughed at him for not using the neural interface, for being too old-fashioned. Now it seemed they were paying the price for their over-reliance on technology. But Alex didn't want to get too confident. The test wasn't over yet. There were still many questions to go, and he needed to stay focused. He could feel the tension building as the countdown clock ticked down. The aliens around him were now visibly panicked, glancing at each other, their faces tight with stress. Their screens flickered and buzzed with warnings. One of the aliens, a tall, insectoid being with 6 legs and a chitinous exoskeleton, slammed its interface onto the desk in frustration. "This is impossible," it hissed. "The calculations aren't working." Its 4 eyes were wide with panic, and it began to tear at the straps of the neural interface, as though the device itself was to blame for its failure. Alex kept moving through the questions, his mind sharp, his thoughts clear. He noticed that the aliens around him had stopped typing so rapidly. Some of them were sitting back in their seats, their eyes closed in frustration. They were trying to calm themselves, but it was clear they were starting to doubt their ability to finish the test in time. He glanced down at his screen again. The next question was a tricky one. It was a math problem that involved several steps, but Alex didn't panic. He calmly broke the problem down into smaller parts, solving it piece by piece. He knew this was where the aliens were struggling. They weren't thinking critically anymore. They were just trying to keep up with their malfunctioning technology, and that was a dangerous mistake. Time was running out. The aliens were starting to whisper nervously to each other. Their screens flashed erratically, and the exam hall was filled with the sound of frustrated mutterings. The last few minutes of the test were quickly approaching, and Alex could see it in their faces. They were losing their confidence. But not Alex. He was still moving steadily through the exam, his focus unbroken. The confusion around him only fueled his determination. He knew that the more the aliens struggled, the more they would realize something important. That technology couldn't replace the power of a clear mind. The room was thick with tension. The soft hum of the exam hall was now interrupted by the occasional sounds of alien devices malfunctioning. Alex kept his focus, his fingers moving steadily across the keys. He had been working at his own pace, calm and sure, while the aliens around him were falling into chaos. Their faces were a mix of confusion, frustration, and desperation. The countdown clock was ticking, and every second felt heavier than the last. Alex glanced around the room. The once confident aliens, who had mocked him earlier for not using the neural interface, now seemed unsure of themselves. Some were staring blankly at their screens, their interfaces buzzing with error messages. Others were frantically pressing buttons, hoping for a solution that didn't come. One alien, a tall, muscular being with shimmering purple skin, was visibly shaking. Its large eyes darted back and forth between the screen and the malfunctioning neural interface. The alien's breathing grew heavy, and its once smooth movements had turned jerky, as if it couldn't control the panic that was rising inside. Alex didn't look away. He knew that this was the moment when everything could change. The test was almost over, and it was clear that the aliens were struggling more and more with each passing minute. It was almost as if the technology they had relied on so heavily was now betraying them. The quiet mutters of frustration turned into louder voices. "What's wrong with this thing? One alien shouted, "I'm losing time." Another one slammed its fist on the desk in frustration, the sound echoing through the hall. Alex could hear the panic starting to spread, and it made him feel even more confident in his decision to rely on his own mind. But as the tension built, Alex's focus never wavered. He finished the current question and moved on to the next one. His fingers moved fluidly, solving each problem with ease. The questions were getting harder, but he didn't mind. He knew that if he took his time and thought carefully, he would get the answers right. The aliens, on the other hand, seemed to be getting worse with every passing minute. One alien, a small round creature with bright yellow eyes, was visibly shaking. It had begun to sweat, its tiny body covered in nervous beads of moisture. The creature kept pressing the reset button on its interface, trying to get it to work. But each time, a new error message appeared on the screen. It was clearly losing its composure, and its once confident expression had turned into one of pure panic. Alex couldn't help but notice how the alien's face was flushed with anxiety. The creature was still trying to fix its device, but it was becoming clear that the tech was beyond repair. The alien had become too reliant on it, and now that it was failing, there was nothing it could do to catch up. Alex shifted his attention back to his screen, feeling the pressure rising but refusing to let it affect him. He had been through harder situations. He had learned long ago that the key to success was staying calm when others around you were losing control. The tension in the room was palpable. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The countdown clock continued to tick down, and Alex could see that many of the aliens had already fallen behind. They had spent so much time trying to fix their interfaces that they were now losing valuable moments. The more Alex watched, the more he realized how big the gap between him and the other participants had grown. He wasn't just ahead of them. He was moving at a pace they couldn't keep up with. He wasn't even sweating. His mind was sharp, and he trusted it completely. One of the aliens, a massive creature with thick green scales and sharp claws, let out a frustrated roar. It had thrown its neural interface to the side and was now glaring at the screen, as if blaming it for its failure. The alien's massive hands clenched into fists, and its chest heaved with angry breaths. But there was nothing it could do. The exam was still going, and time was running out. Alex glanced at the countdown clock again. There were only a few minutes left. He had almost finished the exam, and he knew that, despite the alien's panic, he was going to be the first one to submit his answers. The thought made him feel a surge of pride. He had chosen to rely on his own mind, and it had paid off. As the final seconds ticked down, the room seemed to hold its breath. The aliens were now in full panic mode. Some were pacing around, muttering to themselves, while others were frantically typing in a last-ditch effort to finish. The once confident beings who had laughed at Alex for not using a neural interface were now struggling to finish in time. The countdown clock reached 0. The final buzzer sounded. Alex took a deep breath, leaned back in his chair, and clicked the submit button. The room was still for a moment, as if time itself had frozen. Alex felt his heart race, but he kept his expression calm. He had done it. He had finished. Around him, the aliens were still trying to finish, their screens flashing with error messages. Some had barely completed half the exam, while others were still trapped in confusion. Alex knew he had succeeded. He had done something that the others hadn't. The simple act of trusting his own mind, free from the interference of technology. The room was eerily quiet after the buzzer rang. Most of the aliens were still staring at their screens, their faces twisted in frustration and panic. The exam was officially over, and Alex leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of relief and pride. He had finished before anyone else, and he knew it wasn't just luck. His calm, focused approach had made all the difference. He looked around the room, taking in the sight of the other participants. Some aliens had stopped typing altogether, their eyes wide with disbelief as they stared at their malfunctioning interfaces. Others were frantically typing away, trying to finish the exam. but the clock had already run out. Alex felt a small sense of victory, but he knew this was only part of the challenge. There was still the final result to come. The exam hall was silent for a long moment. The tension from before was still hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The aliens seemed unsure of what to do next, unsure whether their efforts had been enough to finish in time. Alex knew that it wasn't just about finishing the exam. It was about how well you could perform under pressure, and the others hadn't done well at all. Suddenly, the screen at the front of the room flashed to life. A new message appeared for everyone to see, causing Alex's heart to skip a beat. It wasn't the result of the exam. No, this was something far more unexpected. ALERT. Final exam results will be delayed. Due to technical errors, all participants must retempt the exam. Instructions to follow. Alex blinked in confusion. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the other aliens stared at the screen in shock. "What?" one of them whispered. "How is that possible?" The small, round alien with yellow eyes, who had been shaking earlier, was now standing up in disbelief. "We've all finished," it protested, looking around at the others. "How can the results be delayed? We passed, didn't we?" The room filled with murmurs as the aliens began to argue. Something went wrong with the system. Another alien with long tentacles said, "But we should be finished. We solved everything. Why should we have to retake it?" Alex leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He had expected a simple result, but this was far from what he anticipated. What was going on? Was this some sort of mistake? Or was it part of the exam, some trick designed to test them further? As the aliens debated, a new message appeared on the screen, making Alex's stomach twist with confusion. "Attention! All neural interfaces are being temporarily disabled. Please stand by." A ripple of surprise spread across the room. What did this mean? Alex glanced at the others. The aliens who had been relying on their neural interfaces were now looking around nervously, as if they could feel the shift in the atmosphere. And then, the screens in front of them flickered off completely. The exam room was plunged into silence. Alex's heart began to race. What had just happened? The technology that had been the alien's lifeline was now completely gone. He hadn't used the neural interface, but he knew this could throw off everything for the others. Without their tech, they were lost. Some of them started to fidget nervously, clearly unsure how to proceed without their devices. He heard a loud gasp. The tall, muscular alien who had been so anxious earlier looked like it was about to lose control. It reached up to its head and began tugging at the neural interface as if trying to remove it. But the interface had completely shut down, and no matter how hard it pulled, it couldn't get it to work. The small round alien with yellow eyes stood frozen in place, its face pale. It didn't know what to do anymore. Without its interface, it was helpless. The creature had relied so heavily on the technology that it had no backup plan. Alex, however, remained calm. He didn't need the technology. The rest of the room was filled with the sounds of panic as the aliens tried to figure out what had happened. Some of them were frantically pressing buttons on their devices, but nothing was responding. Others stood up, pacing back and forth, muttering under their breath. And then, as if it was a cruel twist of fate, the lights above flickered and dimmed. The overhead monitors buzzed and blinked in an eerie pattern, and the large doors at the back of the room creaked open with a loud metallic groan. A figure stepped through the doorway. It was one of the exam supervisors, an alien with a sleek, robotic body and glowing blue eyes. The supervisor stood tall, its metal arms folded across its chest, as it surveyed the room with an unreadable expression. Its robotic voice echoed through the silence. "All participants are to follow new instructions. The exam was never about your technology. It was about how well you could think without it. Now you will be tested again, but this time you will rely on your own skills. Prepare yourselves." Alex's eyes widened as the implications of the announcement sank in. The exam hadn't been about using the technology at all. It had been a test of their ability to think without it. The aliens around him, who had relied so heavily on their interfaces, were now starting to panic in a whole new way. Without their devices, they were completely lost. They had never been trained to think independently, and now they were facing the consequences of their over-reliance on technology. Alex couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. The twist had caught everyone off guard, but he had been ready. He had prepared for this moment, even if he hadn't known it would come. He trusted his own mind, and now it was clear that it was the one thing that would set him apart. The room buzzed with nervous energy. The aliens, who had been so confident just moments ago, were now frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The robotic supervisor's announcement still echoed in their minds. The exam hadn't been about technology after all. It was about how well they could think for themselves. Alex sat quietly, watching the chaos unfold. The aliens around him were still trying to reboot their neural interfaces, frantically tapping at their devices, but the screens remained dark. The small alien with yellow eyes was wringing its tiny hands, pacing back and forth. The tall purple-skinned alien was growling under its breath, frustration evident in every movement. They were all in shock. The one thing they had relied on, technology, was no longer available to them. They had never considered the possibility that their advanced systems might fail, but now that they had, they were scrambling for answers. As the tension grew, the doors at the back of the room opened again. This time, the person who walked through was not just another supervisor. It was the head of the exam, the alien professor. The professor was a tall, imposing figure with sleek silver skin and glowing green eyes. Its presence immediately commanded attention. The moment it stepped into the room, all the noise stopped. The aliens fell silent, their gazes locked onto the professor. They knew this was the one they had to impress. This was the being that held the power to decide their fate. The professor's voice echoed in the room, calm but with an unmistakable authority. "It seems some of you are struggling," the professor said, its voice laced with amusement. "But don't be too upset. You're not the first to face such challenges." The aliens exchanged confused looks. What was the professor talking about? They had never faced anything like this before. They were used to being the ones in control, with their advanced technology at their fingertips. But now, they were vulnerable, and it was obvious that they didn't know how to handle it. The professor looked around the room, its green eyes scanning each alien one by one. "You all rely so heavily on your technology," it continued, "but you forget the most important thing. Technology is a tool, not the answer. It's your mind that holds the true power." Alex couldn't help but smirk to himself. The professor's words hit a nerve with the others. They had underestimated the importance of thinking independently. They had placed too much trust in their gadgets, and now they were paying the price. The professor turned its gaze toward Alex, and for the first time, a hint of surprise flickered in its eyes. "And you," it said, voice suddenly sharp, "you finished the exam without even using your neural interface. How is that possible?" Alex didn't flinch. He had expected the question. In fact, he was ready for it. He knew this was his moment to prove that the humans weren't just lucky. They were resourceful. He stood up, looking the professor in the eye. "I trust my mind," Alex said simply. "I don't need a device to tell me what I already know." A small smile tugged at the corner of the professor's lips, but it was clear that this wasn't what the professor had expected to hear. The aliens around Alex were staring at him now, some in disbelief, others in confusion. They had never seen anyone approach the exam like this before. The professor's eyes narrowed, as if trying to understand Alex's mindset. "You're saying you didn't need the neural interface?" it asked. "Then why did you even come to this exam if you didn't intend to use the technology?" Alex shrugged. "Because the test wasn't about the technology. It was about what I could do without it. And I think that's something you've forgotten." The professor was silent for a moment. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. The aliens watched the exchange between Alex and the professor, unsure of how to react. They had never seen an Earthling speak so confidently in front of one of their most respected leaders. Finally, the professor spoke again, its voice softer this time. "You may be right," it admitted, as if processing the idea for the first time. "Perhaps I underestimated you. But understand this, technology has its limits. It's only as good as the mind behind it." Alex nodded, his confidence growing. "Exactly," he said. "I've learned it the hard way. Technology can fail, but your mind never will. Not if you know how to use it." The professor studied Alex for a long moment before finally nodding slowly. "You have a unique perspective," it said. "Perhaps humans are more resourceful than I gave them credit for, but don't get too comfortable. There are still many tests ahead. The real challenge is how you handle the next one." With that, the professor turned and walked toward the exit. The aliens in the room remained still, processing the unexpected turn of events. They had come into this exam with the belief that technology was everything. But now, they were faced with a reality they hadn't prepared for. Alex watched the professor leave, feeling a sense of pride swelling inside him. He hadn't just passed the test. He had shown the aliens something they hadn't expected. He had proven that it wasn't the technology that made you smart. It was the mind. And that was something that no amount of advanced gadgets could replace. As the room settled back into an uneasy silence, the aliens began to turn to each other, murmuring quietly. They were beginning to understand the lesson Alex had taught them, whether they liked it or not. The professor might have been shocked, but Alex knew this was just the beginning. The room had fallen into a tense silence after the professor's departure. The aliens were no longer arguing or scrambling to fix their malfunctioning devices. Instead, they were deep in thought, processing everything that had happened. Alex could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. The challenge was far from over, but he had already made his mark. He had proven something they hadn't expected. As the minutes ticked by, Alex stood still, watching the others. Some of them were still adjusting to the fact that the technology they had depended on had failed them. But Alex wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the next step, the next challenge that awaited them. The alien with yellow eyes, the one who had been pacing nervously earlier, finally approached Alex. It looked up at him, its face no longer filled with panic, but with something else. Respect. I never thought about it like that," the alien said quietly. "You didn't rely on the interface. You trusted your mind." It paused for a moment, as if trying to fully understand what Alex had done. "Maybe we've been too dependent on our technology. Maybe you're right." Alex gave a small nod. He could see the change in the alien's demeanor. It was no longer mocking or dismissive. It was beginning to understand. And that was the first step. Around the room, other aliens began to approach him, one by one. The tall, purple-skinned alien, who had been so frustrated during the exam, walked over with a slow, deliberate pace. "I have to admit," it said, its voice rough but not unfriendly. "I thought you were crazy. Who doesn't use the interface during an exam?" It let out a short laugh. "But now I see. Maybe you have something we don't." Alex smiled, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The point had been made. The aliens were starting to realize that there was more to intelligence than just relying on technology. It wasn't about having the most advanced tools. It was about using what you had to its fullest potential. The others were slowly catching on too. The small, round alien with the nervous energy was no longer fidgeting. Instead, it stood tall, its posture a little straighter. "Maybe we've forgotten how to think for ourselves," it admitted, looking around the room at its fellow aliens. "We've been so focused on using our tools, we forgot what it feels like to just think." Alex could see the change in the room. The atmosphere had shifted. The tension had melted away, replaced by something new. It was as if the aliens were realizing that their reliance on technology wasn't the answer. It was the human way of thinking that had given Alex the upper hand. The way he had approached the exam, not with advanced gadgets, but with his own knowledge and intuition, had been the key to his success. The robotic supervisor, who had been standing silently at the back of the room, now stepped forward. It wasn't a living being, but even it seemed to have a new understanding. This exam was meant to test your adaptability, it said, its voice devoid of emotion, but with an undeniable hint of respect. Alex has proven that he is adaptable. He passed this test in a way none of us anticipated. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't from confusion or fear. It was from admiration. The aliens had been humbled. They had seen firsthand how a human had faced a challenge without relying on the same tools that they used every day. And they had learned something important, that the mind, when used correctly, was more powerful than any interface. As the minutes passed, the aliens slowly began to return to their seats. They were no longer eyeing Alex with suspicion or doubt. They were looking at him with something different now: respect. There were no more whispers or sideways glances. Instead, they nodded at him, acknowledging his achievement. The alien with the long tentacles, who had been the most vocal during the exam, was now looking at Alex with a thoughtful expression. "You're not just clever," it said quietly. "You're resourceful. You didn't need the technology. You just used your brain. That's something we've forgotten to do." Alex nodded again. "Sometimes we all forget. But in the end, it's about using what we have. And the most powerful tool we have is right here," he said, tapping his head lightly. The atmosphere in the room was now completely different. The aliens had come in with a sense of superiority, relying on their advanced technology to see them through. But now, they were humbled. They had seen what true adaptability and resourcefulness looked like, and it had come from the human who had refused to follow the usual path. As the supervisor made the final announcement to wrap up the exam, Alex felt a sense of pride swell within him. He hadn't just completed the challenge. He had changed the way the aliens saw the world. They had come to understand that intelligence wasn't just about tools or technology. It was about how you used your mind to navigate the challenges that life threw at you. The professor might have been shocked at Alex's success, but in the end, it was clear. The respect he had earned wasn't just for his skills, but for the mindset that had made all the difference. The aliens may have had their advanced technology, but Alex had something they hadn't counted on: his ability to think beyond the limits of what they had always known. As Alex left the exam room, the aliens watched him with a newfound respect. He had proven them wrong, and in doing so, he had taught them the most important lesson of all: that true strength comes from within.